Under the glittering chandeliers of the Clarendon Grand, the lobby gleamed like a stage awaiting its grand performance. Every polished tile reflected the careful attention poured into this day, because tonight was no ordinary evening. The hotel's general manager, Martin Huxley, had spent the entire week ensuring that every corner shone, every glass sparkled, and every staff member knew their role. The reason for such intensity was clear. Victor Liang, one of Asia's most influential real estate investors, was arriving with a delegation of senior partners. His company had recently expanded its luxury portfolio into Europe, and the Clarendon Grand was eager, desperate even, to secure a place in his list of preferred partners. If Victor liked what he saw, the hotel's reputation would soar internationally. If he didn't, this opportunity would vanish into thin air. At exactly 5:50 p.m., the security radios crackled. Convoy approaching, ETA 3 minutes. Martin straightened his tie, smoothed the lapels of his suit, and glanced at his assistant. Remember, his English is perfect. We'll keep everything in English so there's no confusion, he said with the certainty of someone who thought he had all the variables under control. Several managers exchanged wary glances. One of them, a marketing coordinator named Elena, murmured, "I heard he prefers Mandarin for business discussions." Martin waved it off. "Relax. We've got translation apps if needed. No point in complicating things." Outside, the dark-tinted SUVs rolled up in flawless formation. Uniformed doormen stepped forward to open the doors, and Victor Liang emerged, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his expression as unreadable as a stone statue. 6 associates followed, each carrying sleek leather folders. Martin greeted them warmly, offering his hand. "Mr. Liang, welcome to the Clarendon Grand," Victor Ga, via curt nod, then spoke in fluid Mandarin, his tone smooth, yet deliberate. Martin's smile froze for a fraction of a second. He subtly tapped his smartwatch, activating the translator app linked to his earpiece. "A moment, please," he said, glancing at the device as it began to spit out awkwardly fragmented phrases. The words were choppy, disjointed, something about vertical zoning restrictions and hospitality clusters. Martin's brow furrowed. He glanced at Elena, who pretended not to notice the tension building. The associates exchanged brief looks, their expressions unreadable but their silence heavy. Meanwhile, in the far corner of the lobby, a man in a gray maintenance uniform pushed a cart stacked with cleaning supplies toward the service elevator. His name badge read Caleb Brooks. To most guests, he was invisible, the quiet janitor who polished brass rails and mopped marble floors without a sound. But what no one here knew was that Caleb had once been a top language student at Beijing Language and Culture University, earning accolades for his fluency in Mandarin and Cantonese. Years ago, he had dreamed of working in international relations, but a combination of family obligations and financial setbacks had forced him to put those dreams aside. Instead, he had taken whatever jobs kept the bills paid, and over time, life had placed him here, in this hotel, working night shifts to keep the lobby shining while others conducted high-stakes meetings in the boardrooms above. Caleb's ears caught the rhythm of Victor's Mandarin as he rolled past. Even without consciously trying, his mind translated the words. Victor was asking very specific questions about changes in the city's mixed-use development laws and the impact of tax incentives on culturally integrated hotel projects. The translation app Martin relied on was missing nuance, badly. It was turning complex policy questions into nonsense phrases about moon festivals and guest room trees. Caleb slowed his pace, frowning. He had seen this before, a critical conversation derailed by poor translation, opportunities slipping away because the right voice wasn't in the room. He told himself to keep walking. This wasn't his place. He was just a janitor, on paper anyway, and nobody here would appreciate him stepping in. Still, he couldn't shake the thought that he was watching the hotel's chances evaporate right in front of him. Martin, now visibly flustered, tried to steer the conversation toward the prepared presentation in the boardroom. "Perhaps we can review the visual materials," he suggested, but Victor pressed on in Mandarin, clearly wanting direct answers before proceeding. His associates began to close their folders, a subtle signal that their interest was waning. In the hallway outside the boardroom, the tension was palpable. Elena whispered, "Martin, we need a proper interpreter. Now." Martin snapped, "Do you see one magically standing here?" Caleb, standing near the service entrance, realized that he had just answered that question in his head. Yes, there was one, and it was him. He took a deep breath, set the cleaning cart against the wall, and stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to make the room turn toward him. Martin's expression hardened instantly. "Caleb, now is not the time." But Caleb didn't look at him. Instead, he addressed Victor directly in flawless Mandarin, his tone respectful yet confident. "Mr. Liang, I understand you're asking about the recent zoning regulation changes and how they would affect a hotel retail integration project like this one. If you'd allow me, I can help clarify in your language so there's no risk of misunderstanding." For a moment, silence blanketed the room. Victor studied Caleb with a faint tilt of the head, as though assessing whether this unexpected interruption was worth entertaining. Then, with the faintest trace of curiosity in his eyes, he replied, in rapid Mandarin, laced with a regional accent, "Tell me then, what is the maximum floor height under the new regulation for mixed-use projects in the Central District, and how does it compare to the Shanghai model?" Caleb didn't miss a beat. The new framework allows up to 40 floors, provided circulation metrics are met and the design supports both tourism and business corridors. This is actually more flexible than Shanghai's current model, where height limits are stricter near heritage zones. Your project here would likely qualify for dual permitting advantages and targeted tax reductions if it incorporates authentic cultural exchange elements. The associates' pens began to move in unison, jotting notes. Martin's face, however, was frozen in disbelief. This wasn't the stumbling janitor he thought he knew. This was someone commanding the room with precision and poise. Victor asked another question, this time about foreign investment tax breaks tied to cultural components in commercial hospitality spaces. Caleb explained, citing the exact clauses and comparing them to similar programs in Beijing and Guangzhou. His responses were concise, structured, and sprinkled with practical suggestions for the Clarendon Grand to adapt its offerings to Chinese business traveler preferences, like a dedicated tea service near meeting rooms, east-facing suite allocations, and full integration of digital payment systems like WeChat Pay and Alipay. By the time Caleb finished, the tone of the meeting had shifted entirely. Victor was leaning forward, his associates engaged, and Elena's eyes were wide with something between shock and admiration. Martin, though still silent, understood that the very deal he feared losing had just been salvaged, not by his prepared slides, but by the janitor he'd barely acknowledged before. The boardroom settled into a new cadence the moment Caleb stopped translating like a machine and began guiding meaning like a bridge, and what had started as an awkward presentation with jittering slides and stiff smiles became an open sketchbook of possibilities laid out in 2 languages, the edges smoothed by respect. Victor shifted from interrogative to exploratory, framing scenarios rather than traps, and the associates followed his lead, testing Caleb's understanding with layered hypotheticals about the guest journey, compliance thresholds, and how to convert cultural recognition into measurable revenue without cheapening it into a gimmick. And every time Caleb answered, he spoke to Victor first in Mandarin, confirming nuance and intent, then pivoted to English so Martin's team could hear both the content and the context. He suggested a small tea lounge positioned on the sightline between the conference suites and the elevators, not as an ornamental corner but as a pre-negotiation space with a timed ritual to shift guests from hurry to focus. He recommended a pilot for WeChat Pay and Alipay at the front desk, restaurants and minibar via a PSP with dynamic QR linked to individual bills rather than static codes taped to a register. And he proposed family-linked inventory rules and late checkout tiers to support multi-generation trips common among Chinese executives who extend business stays into short family visits. And as he spoke, the room's energy rose in steady increments, pens moving, trust forming, the hotel's carefully ironed certainty replaced by something better, a plan that could bend without breaking. When Victor asked about risk, Caleb didn't blink. He outlined 3 red flags. Authorities would check first, circulation pressure at peak hours when retail and hotel traffic overlap, fire evacuation maps that must be functionally separated despite physical adjacency, and the back-of-house logistics that too often collapse when a retail loading bay slices through a hotel's service arteries. And then he layered a solution architecture on top, describing a light but disciplined governance model that would keep retail and hotel operations rhythmically in step without merging them into an auditing nightmare, an SPV to separate cash flows, SLAs with time targets for waste removal and guest flow resets after event breaks, and a small cross-functional oversight cell to read the numbers weekly and decide whether to deepen, pause, or roll back the pilots. Victor's pen paused on that verb, roll back, and he looked up, recognizing a professional who was not selling him a forever fix, but a reversible experiment with clear kill switches, and the faint smile he gave was the kind investors reserve for people who understand the cost of being wrong. It did not escape anyone that Martin had receded to the edge of his own meeting, and somewhere between the third compliance answer and the fourth operational diagram, he understood the most painful part. He had equated authority with talking the most, and he had confused tools with talent. He had told himself that a translator app upgraded last week could carry the burden of a conversation that demanded judgment, and he had accepted the comfortable fiction that because Olivia, or now Caleb, wore a uniform that blended into the corridors, their minds must do the same, and shame tugged at him as he watched an outcome he wanted very badly, now depend on someone he had never asked a real question beyond, "Can you take care of that spill?" Yet in that shame, a better instinct cracked open, the one that had made him love hotels in the first place. The choreography of different skills making a single guest feel held, and he made a small decision that would change more than he knew. He closed his laptop and started taking notes by hand, not the numbers he already understood, but the names he didn't, writing Caleb, governance plus pilots, asked to lead design sprint, and just below it, Elena, owner of comms, and then underlined both twice. The conversation ran on rails for another 40 minutes, and when Victor finally stood, he didn't offer the polite nothing of corporate diplomacy. He gave a tangible next step, a 2-week window to present a micro-implementation of the T-Lounge, payments integration, and family link inventory with KPI scaffolding and a pre-mortem on how the pilots could fail. And if the Clarendon Grand demonstrated the discipline to learn in public without hiding setbacks, he would move the property into an evaluation track for his European portfolio. In Mandarin, he added a sentence meant for Caleb alone, but delivered for everyone to hear. The person who understands. The bridge must help design the road. And then he shook hands, including Caleb, with the precise warmth of a man who measured gestures like investments, and the convoy left as smoothly as it had arrived, the doors closing on a lobby that suddenly felt too small for its own possibilities. When the echoes faded and the adrenaline cooled, a different kind of noise rose, the quiet friction of status recalibrating. Elena was the first to break the spell, catching Caleb just as he turned toward his cart and saying thank you, with a steadiness that steadied him in return, then handing him a legal pad already ruled into columns labeled pilot, owner, deadline, risk, and metric, because she had recognized in the room not only his knowledge, but his cadence, the way he sequenced possible from necessary. A cluster of department heads formed, front office, FB, housekeeping, finance, and in that makeshift circle, Martin did the thing he would not have done 3 hours earlier. He named the facts out loud without hedging, told them he had underestimated a risk, acknowledged he had overlooked a talent, and asked for their help not to save face but to build a better face. He turned to Caleb and said, not ceremonially but practically, I need you to lead the pilot design sprint starting tomorrow morning at 9. Title or pay we will fix, but the work can't wait. And for a heartbeat, Caleb flinched toward the familiar corridor of invisibility, the place where you say, I'm just a janitor, but then he saw the legal pad and the inked columns and the empty boxes waiting to become a plan, and he nodded. On day 4, resistance surfaced in the open, not as mutiny but as concern. A group of servers worried that the T schedule would back up tray service, a night auditor fretted about reconciliation loads, and a concierge who prided himself on champagne knowledge felt his expertise slipping from the spotlight. Rather than defend the plan, Caleb pulled a stool into the middle of the lounge at 2:15 p.m., 10 minutes before the first T block, and asked them to describe what they feared in verbs, not adjectives. From those verbs, he carved countermoves, moving tray staging 2 meters closer to the elevator cut steps by 8 per run, The night auditor got a temporary 30-minute shift overlap for week 1 with a checklist that halved second-glance errors, and the concierge, to his own surprise, discovered that introducing the tea lounge with a single sentence that connected it to negotiation focus drew more appreciative nods from guests than his memorized monologue on vintages, and he began to enjoy the look of recognition that flickered when he served understanding rather than awe. On the morning of day 6, when the pilots had just begun to find their breath, reality punched. A regional competitor, the Oriole, took out a full-screen ad on a business traveler app flaunting its authentic tea ceremony, all satin and spectacle, a costumed attendant and a choreographed bow, and the clip ricocheted through staff phones followed by a ripple of insecurity. Were they too modest, too earnest, too unfancy to stand out? Elena called a 5-minute huddle and asked a single question. What problem are we solving? And when the answers came, friction at the hinge between travel and tense meetings, payments that feel like park break jerks, room logistics that respect how families actually move. She wrote them on the whiteboard in thick strokes and circled them twice. Caleb added one sentence beneath, "We are building a bridge, not a show." And then he did something that surprised even Martin. He sent the Oriole clip to Victor with a one-line note. "We saw this. Our approach stays focused on utility and measurement. If that ever slips, we'll end it." And the reply, hours later, was a thumbs-up emoji, followed by a calendar invite for a site visit on day 12. The visit might have gone smoothly, if not for a confluence of small failures that arrived like weather. 15 minutes before tea, a payment terminal at the lounge lost network. Housekeeping was 8 minutes behind on a connecting room turn because a child's forgotten stuffed panda had sent a young attendant searching 3 floors, and a front desk handover ran long when a guest insisted he had paid with the wrong QR in the wrong restaurant. Martin felt the old panic flex and rise, the part of him that wanted to bark orders and tighten the world into a fist. But he saw Caleb step into the gap and do what leaders do when time compresses. He gave people one action each. "Noah, bring up the fallback SIM router now, Sophia. Shift pour to station 2 and announce a low-voice delay script we wrote for precisely this. Priya, reassign a floater to that room and log the panda in the lost and found flow so the child has a traceable path. Elena, meet the guest, pull the reconciliation reference from the laminated sheet, and speak the exact words that de-escalate without blaming." It looked effortless because it had been rehearsed on paper, and just as the elevator chimed and Victor's party stepped into the lobby, the SIM router blinked green, the T-block opened on a whisper rather than a clatter, and a front desk agent handed a printed slip with the right reference code to the guest, who softened, at the sight of his mistake, recognized and corrected without humiliation. By 8 the next morning, the hibiscus room, usually reserved for wedding tastings, had been transformed into a war room. Masking tape swim lanes ran across the walls, sticky notes bred in neon colonies, a whiteboard sketched a process map from arrival to reconciliation, and a one-page brief at every seat set the rules of the sprint in plain language. Scope 3 pilots only, designed for reversibility, tie every action to a measure that can be read by someone not in this room, and name failure modes before success posters. Caleb opened the session without flourish, a soft baritone that filled space without crowding it, reminding everyone that this was not about performing a culture for applause, but about removing friction for guests who were already here, already paying, already forming opinions. Noah from IT diagrammed 2 payments paths, PSP with dynamic QR and a fallback route for network instability, while Sophia from FB built a TSOP that read like choreography, temperature bands and steep times nested with service cues and a short script explaining not the mystique but the purpose of the ritual, and Priya from Room stood at the inventory screen with a pen tucked behind her ear, drafting rules for connecting room packages that would keep housekeeping loads predictable and avoid the hidden cost creep Caleb warned about. 2 hours into the sprint, a ghost from the previous day walked through the door, a veteran bartender named Marco, who had muttered in the staff corridor that the hotel was turning into a tea house. He stood with arms folded until Sophia asked him to test the tea pour height, because his hands understood flow and grace from years of pouring wine without bruising it, and when he performed the low pour with the quiet dignity of his craft, even he felt the line cross in his own body, from skepticism to contribution, and he stayed, offering small fixes that saved seconds and prevented spills because in operations, seconds are currency. Finance built the first KPI sheet with numbers that could be extracted daily without overtime. Housekeeping proposed micro-adjustments to cart layout for tea lounge adjacent floors to reduce reset time. And Elena, who had been listening more than speaking, finally stepped forward to write the guest-facing copy that would live in the elevator screens and room tablets, language that explained the tea schedule as a service to focus, not a spectacle to watch. By day 3, the tea lounge existed in embryo, not a velvet-roped sanctuary, but 4 tables on a clean sightline, straight-back chairs, a modest shelf of white tea, oolong and pu'er, water set to the right temperature and replenished on a timer, a small ritual printed in 18-point font behind the counter to guide staff without turning them into actors. Payments went live at the front desk, and one restaurant with a laminated 5-step failsafe pinned under every terminal, and the connecting room package quietly opened on the booking engine with an east-facing preference coded by Priya's pencil racy turned into permissions. Caleb walked between zones like a conductor with no baton, checking the edges first, the refund path, the out-of-network language at the terminal, the 3-step handoff between tea and meeting, because he had learned the hard way that details fail in corners, not center stage. Victor walked the line like an inspector from a film, soft shoes, sharp eyes, touching nothing but seeing everything. He asked a server in Mandarin why the pour was low, and she answered in English that it prevents scalding aroma shock and respects the tea, and then added in careful Mandarin the same sentence, the pride on her face unforced. He asked to pay with Alipay and received a receipt with a reconciliation code that matched the sheet under the terminal, and when he stood at the balcony rail looking down at the lobby, he saw the tea lounge positioned exactly where it caught people who might have scattered, and he nodded slightly as if agreeing with a person inside himself. In the debrief, he did not compliment the decor. He commended the ability to fail small and recover fast, and his only prescription was to hold the line against spectacle, because utility would become its own aesthetic if they let it. Then he turned to Caleb and asked a question that sounded like a joke but was not. What title should you have had this week? And the room laughed, grateful for relief, but Martin felt the truth land like a promise. He spoke before anyone else, steady, public, committing himself to a future that his private notes had already sketched. And he said the words without flinching. Interim Director of International Guest Experience, with authority to run the pilots to scale, and a compensation package that honors the value we've all witnessed. Titles don't fix hearts, but they fix levers, and over the next days, those levers moved. HR expedited a banding review, payroll recoded a grade, and Elena drafted a staff announcement that named the why without making anyone small, because the new story the hotel was writing could not replace old invisibilities with new performative crowns. Caleb still started his shifts by checking the corners, but now those corners were policy. Edges, SOP tails, and metric definitions, the quiet places where complexity turned into failure if ignored, and even as the pilots posted early wins, T-adjacent FB rose 17% over baseline during negotiation windows, digital payment transactions climbed past 30% among Chinese guests, connecting room bookings increased by 21% in week 2. He kept asking the team to look for noise beneath the signal. The concierge tracked whether guests lingered at the lounge after meetings. Noah measured fallback router uptime so they wouldn't mistake luck for resilience. Sophia counted not only revenue but returns from staff who reported less verbal friction with guests, a human metric that mattered because the work itself was lighter when the rituals honored reality. Yet momentum has gravity, and not all of it pulls the way you want. A rival hotel reached out to Caleb through a recruiter with a package that would have made his old self dizzy, and a well-meaning friend pressed him to leave now while the market heat was fresh. But in the quiet of his small kitchen, Caleb turned the offer card over beneath his fingers and remembered the look in the night auditor's eyes when the overlap shift appeared like oxygen, the small bow the server had given Victor when she answered him in his language without shrinking, and the way Martin had stepped aside, then forward in the right order. He did not owe the Clarendon his future, but he owed himself the dignity of finishing what he had started, to write it down so it would outlast him. And when he replied to the recruiter, he wrote a sentence that surprised even him. "I'm building a system here. Call me again when it runs without me." And he smiled at the audacity of that claim, then set his phone down and opened a notebook titled Bridges, page 1, already filled with the rule he had discovered on the worst days and confirmed on the best, not poetry, just practice. See the person, read the context, design the path, measure the truth, and be willing to take it apart if it lies. Late one evening, when the lounge had closed and the lobby lights were softened to a pearl hush, Martin stood beneath the mezzanine and watched the night team glide through their routines, the choreography tighter but gentler, and he thought of the first hour of that first meeting with Victor, the way panic had shrunk his world to the size of a malfunctioning translation app. He remembered how leadership had felt then, like an exhausted impersonation, and he tasted the relief of knowing it could feel like this instead, a posture of attention rather than control. He would fail again. He knew that, stumble into old habits when deadlines bit, but he also knew the sentence he would write at the top of every prep document from now on, a sentence he had stolen from the new director he had once called a janitor and would gladly answer to now. People before tools. Language is a business asset, and if you can't translate the why, the numbers are just a costume. And as he closed his notebook, the security radio crackled softly, an early arrival for a late check-in, a family with a sleepy child. So he stepped to the desk to help, because the best culture he could set was still the simplest one, the manager who moved toward the work without announcement, making space for others to be seen. And somewhere across the city, in a quiet apartment with a thrift store table and a plant struggling but not giving up on the sill, Caleb brewed a cup of tea not as performance but as pause, opened an old folder labeled Beijing Notes, and added a fresh page dated today, writing down the names of every person who had pushed the pilots forward when nobody was watching, because the most valuable ledger a hotel keeps is not the balance sheet, but the list of those who practice care, and he promised himself to carry that list into every meeting, to introduce skills before titles, to ask for verbs when fear-spoken adjectives, and to hold the door until others learned they could walk through. The phone buzzed once with a message from Elena, a photo of the whiteboard with a circled word in thick marker, utility, and the caption, "We're still building the bridge," and he replied with a single character he had learned to love for its modesty and power, a character that meant learn, and he set the mug down, and he kept writing. The third week of the pilot program at the Clarendon Grand brought with it a subtle but undeniable change in the way the hotel breathed. What had once been a place where routines were carried out mechanically, trays delivered without eye contact, floors polished without pause, front desk greetings recited like lines from a play, was now a place where people noticed one another. It was not a loud transformation, nor the kind that arrived with corporate press releases or grand speeches. Rather, it was the quiet knitting together of a team that had learned, almost by accident, that their combined intelligence was worth more than the sum of their job descriptions. The tea lounge no longer felt like an experiment. It had become part of the hotel's rhythm. Guests from Victor Liang's circle made a point to schedule meetings around the 2:30 p.m. tea window. Word had spread beyond the intended audience. Japanese corporate groups had begun to request the lounge for pre-meeting gatherings, and a delegation from Seoul asked to shadow the tea service as part of their own cultural exchange program. Even Western guests initially bemused by the concept found themselves curious, lingering over oolong while their business partners discussed strategies in hushed tones. Caleb had made sure the tea service never became ornamental theater. The pour was precise, the etiquette genuine, and the purpose clear. It was a bridge into a conversation, not a show for cameras. In his new role as interim director of international guest experience, Caleb's days were longer but more focused. Each morning began with a review of the prior day's pilot KPIs, tea lounge footfall during the set hour, percentage of transactions processed via WeChat Pay or Alipay, number of connecting room bookings completed. But numbers were only half the picture. He also sought the soft data. How many guests stayed after the tea session instead of dispersing immediately? How often staff initiated conversations in guests' preferred languages? Whether the body language of negotiations shifted after the tea ritual. These subtle indicators mattered because they revealed whether the pilots were achieving their deeper purpose, removing friction and cultivating trust. Caleb held short daily stand-ups with the pilot teams, where he listened more than he spoke. He wanted servers, concierges, and housekeeping staff to tell him, in their own words, what was working and what wasn't. If a staff member admitted that a step in the process was cumbersome or unclear, they worked together to simplify it. No one was dismissed for identifying a flaw. In fact, he treated it as a mark of engagement. Martin watched this new cadence with both admiration and a twinge of humility. He realized that what Caleb was building was not just a service adjustment for Chinese business travelers. It was a cultural operating system for the hotel itself. Staff began taking ownership of problems before they escalated, not out of fear of reprimand, but out of pride in being part of something intelligent. Marco, the bartender who had once scoffed at the tea lounge, now trained junior staff on the low-pour technique and could be overheard explaining the reasoning behind it to guests. Priya, the room's coordinator, refined the connecting room package into a suite of options that catered not only to business families, but to intergenerational leisure travelers. Even Noah from IT, who had originally treated the PSP integration as just another tech ticket, now kept a personal log of system uptime and fallback switchovers, refining the process until it became nearly invisible to the guest. But change, Caleb knew, always invited resistance. As the pilots gained traction, a small but vocal group within the hotel began to question whether this cultural integration approach was skewing the property too heavily toward one demographic. In a manager's meeting, a senior FB figure raised the point bluntly. We are spending disproportionate resources to please one market segment. What about our European corporate clients? Will they feel neglected? Caleb did not deflect the question. He acknowledged the concern and reframed it. We are not replacing one market's needs with another's, he said evenly. We are refining our ability to adapt. Today it's Chinese business travelers. Tomorrow it might be German conference delegates or Middle Eastern family groups. The framework we are building is about agility, not favoritism. He backed this up with data showing that several process improvements like the PSP integration had already benefited a broader range of guests. A Canadian executive, for example, had praised the speed of QR-based payment because it matched the digital systems his own company used. The connecting room packages had been booked by a French film crew and a British family traveling for a wedding. The tea lounge, while culturally specific in its inspiration, had been adopted as a quiet, tech-free meeting zone by guests from every continent. It was during this same meeting that Martin made a rare move. He openly sided with Caleb in front of the senior team, not out of obligation but conviction. If you think this is about pouring tea, he said, you're missing the point. It's about making sure we don't get caught flat-footed the next time a high-value guest comes in speaking a language or carrying expectations we aren't ready for. We're learning to think ahead, not just react. The tone of the conversation shifted after that. While not everyone was fully converted, the skepticism softened into curiosity. Some managers even began to propose their own culturally adaptive initiatives for other guest demographics, from multilingual welcome cards to menu redesigns that highlighted regional dishes without tokenizing them. Outside of the meeting rooms, the changes were even more tangible. Housekeeping staff reported that Mandarin-speaking guests were leaving higher service ratings and more personalized thank you notes. FB revenue during the tea hour was up by nearly 20% from baseline, but more interestingly, the average length of stay for business travelers had increased by half a day, likely due to the multi-generation packages and improved in-room amenities. The finance department confirmed that the pilots were not only paying for themselves but generating a modest profit within weeks. And then, as often happens when an organization starts to get something right, the outside world began to notice. One afternoon, while Caleb was reviewing KPI dashboards in his office, Elena knocked and stepped in with her tablet in hand. You might want to see this, she said, turning the screen toward him. It was an industry blog post shared widely among hospitality professionals, praising the Clarendon Grand's refreshingly authentic approach to cultural integration and guest services. The article, clearly written by Sumyo Sarmis, who had been on the receiving end of the tea lounge experience, highlighted the balance between operational precision and genuine respect for cultural nuance. It contrasted the hotel's approach with the more performative, themed experiences offered by competitors, noting that the Clarendon Grand's version felt both professional and personal. Victor Liang himself had shared the article on his social media with a simple caption, "When service meets understanding, everyone wins." The praise brought a surge of pride across the team, but Caleb kept his focus on the long game. "Recognition is nice," he told Elena, "but it's fragile. The minute we start chasing applause instead of purpose, we lose what made this work." Elena agreed, but she also pointed out that external validation could be leveraged to secure further investment in staff training and pilot expansion. Martin, upon hearing the news, approved an additional budget allocation to run a second wave of cultural adaptation pilots, this time focusing on multilingual concierge support and flexible dining formats for different time zones. The following week, Victor made an unannounced visit, this time accompanied by a smaller group. His manner was more relaxed, and he spent more time observing the lounge, asking low-level staff about their work, and even testing the fallback payment system by accidentally disconnecting from the main network. Everything functioned exactly as designed. In a quiet moment, he pulled Caleb aside. "You've built something scalable," he said in Mandarin. "Not just for this hotel, but for any property willing to listen before it acts." Caleb took the compliment with a nod. But what struck him more was the unspoken trust behind Victor's words, trust earned, not through a single heroic act, but through sustained, disciplined follow-through. As the day wound down and Victor's group departed, Caleb walked the length of the lobby, noting small details, the concierge who switched seamlessly between languages to help a lost guest, the bartender pouring tea with the same precision as a fine wine, the housekeeping attendant explaining the tea schedule to a family in clear, friendly terms. He knew these were the real metrics, the living proof that the bridge he had built was being walked on by others without him needing to hold their hand. Still, he also knew that bridges need maintenance and storms always come. The question was whether the foundation would hold when tested by something bigger than the pilot's controlled conditions. That test was closer than anyone realized. A call from the city's tourism bureau arrived late one evening, informing Martin that an international trade delegation of 30 high-profile investors from 5 different countries, including China, would be staying at the Clarendon Grand for a week-long conference. The delegation's schedule was tight, their expectations high, and their preferences diverse. There would be simultaneous demands for privacy, cultural recognition, and operational excellence at a scale the hotel had not yet tested under the new system. Martin stood in Caleb's doorway with the printout of the itinerary. "We've got 1 week to get ready," he said, his voice steady but laced with the weight of what was coming. Caleb looked at the paper, then back at Martin. "Then we'd better start tomorrow," he replied. And in that moment, both men understood that the real proving ground for everything they had built was about to arrive. The announcement of the upcoming international trade delegation transformed the energy of the Clarendon Grand overnight. The moment the news filtered through the department heads, the hotel's normally composed operations began to hum with a low-bosh, urgent current. 30 high-profile investors from 5 different countries would arrive in staggered waves with overlapping schedules, differing dietary requirements, varied cultural protocols, and a mixture of private and group events that had the potential to test every system the hotel had put in place. It was not just the scale that was daunting, it was the diversity. There would be Mandarin-speaking executives from Beijing and Shanghai, German industrial magnates with an eye for precision, Middle Eastern investors accustomed to a high standard of privacy and discreet service, and North American tech entrepreneurs who valued efficiency and speed over ceremony. To complicate matters, the delegation's conference sessions were split between the hotel's meeting floors and off-site venues, requiring seamless transportation coordination and the ability to adapt services on the fly. Martin knew this was the kind of opportunity that could place the Clarendon Grand in the international spotlight or just as easily expose any weaknesses they hadn't yet addressed. Caleb approached the challenge not with the nervousness of someone fearing a misstep, but with the quiet intensity of a builder testing the limits of his own structure. On the morning after the announcement, he convened a cross-department strategy meeting in the Hibiscus Room, the same space that had served as the war room for the Tea Lounge pilot. This time, the walls were lined not only with process maps, but also with cultural briefing sheets for each nationality in the delegation. The briefing sheets contained practical, non-patronizing insights, preferred forms of address, hospitality customs, dietary considerations, payment preferences, and meeting etiquette. At the top of each sheet was a single guiding principle in bold: serve the person, not the stereotype. Caleb stressed this repeatedly. We're not her, to put on costumes or stage performances, he told the assembled staff. We're here to remove friction and make them feel understood, whatever their background. The first challenge was scheduling. The delegation's events overlapped in ways that would normally cause operational bottlenecks. Breakfast service colliding with early conference departures, tea lounge hours overlapping with private luncheons, room turnovers needed within impossibly short windows. Caleb worked with Priya from rooms and Daniel from finance to map out the pressure points, then layered in staggered staffing plans. They created micro-teams assigned to specific guest groups, with each team cross-trained on the cultural briefing relevant to their assigned guests. Noah from IT established a centralized communication dashboard that allowed these teams to update each other in real time. If a meeting ran long, if a guest changed their dining preference, or if transportation needed to be shifted. The goal was to eliminate the telephone game effect that so often caused service lapses during high-pressure events. Caleb also recognized that while the tea lounge had become a signature offering, it needed to be adapted for the delegation's needs. For the Mandarin-speaking executives, the lounge would operate as usual, preserving the authenticity that had impressed Victor Liang. For the German and North American guests, a parallel focus hour would be introduced in an adjacent space, serving high-quality coffee, herbal infusions, and light snacks with the same quiet, tech-free atmosphere as the tea lounge. This was not about creating separate silos, but about providing culturally attuned entry points into the same underlying concept, a pre-meeting space designed to center the mind and prepare for negotiations. The two lounges would share some staff to ensure cross-pollination of practices, preventing any sense of division. In the days leading up to the delegation's arrival, Caleb made a point of walking every route a guest might take, from the arrival bay to the front desk, from the meeting floors to the lounges, from the dining rooms to the guest suites. He looked for small frictions, a confusing sign, a tight corner in a corridor where luggage and staff carts might collide, a point in the payment process where a guest might hesitate or require assistance. Every friction point was either eliminated or prepared for. Signs were temporarily replaced with clearer multilingual ones. A service elevator was reassigned to guest luggage transport during peak check-in hours. Payment terminals were double-checked for stability, and backup routers were tested under load. The work was not glamorous, but it was the difference between appearing polished and appearing unprepared. When the first wave of guests arrived, a group of 8 Mandarin-speaking executives, Caleb was in the lobby alongside Martin, not behind the scenes. He greeted them in fluent Mandarin, introducing himself not as an interpreter or liaison, but as the hotel's director of international guest experience. The guests responded warmly, immediately relaxing into the interaction. Their luggage was tagged and sent to east-facing suites, as outlined in their preferences, and they were guided to the tea lounge for a brief respite before their first meeting. At the same time, Marco, now as comfortable with the tea ritual as with his original bar duties, was serving coffee in the adjacent focus hour space to a pair of German investors who had just arrived from the airport. The atmosphere in both spaces was calm, intentional, and quietly efficient. By the second day, the complexity of the delegation's overlapping needs began to show. A last-minute schedule change meant that the Middle Eastern investors required a private dining space for an extended lunch, which clashed with a previously scheduled breakout session for the North American group. Rather than scramble, Caleb's team shifted the breakout session to an underused gallery space, quickly transforming it with portable screens and upgraded seating. Priya coordinated with housekeeping to adjust the cleaning schedule so the gallery could be prepped in under an hour. The guests never knew the change had been made. It appeared seamless, which was exactly the point. The real test came midweek, when a critical technology failure threatened to unravel the careful coordination. A citywide network outage disrupted PSP payment systems across multiple districts, including the hotels. For a delegation accustomed to digital payment convenience, this could have been a significant irritant. But Caleb's foresight in creating a fallback system paid off. The staff switched instantly to offline transaction logging, using pre-printed reconciliation slips that matched the PSP records for later processing. Noah's training sessions meant that even junior staff knew exactly how to walk a guest through the offline process without making it seem like a downgrade in service. By the time the network came back online 2 hours later, the guests had barely noticed there had been a disruption. Martin, watching all of this unfold, understood that what he was witnessing went beyond operational skill. It was the product of a mindset shift, one Caleb had initiated but which the staff had embraced as their own. They were no longer simply executing instructions. They were thinking like hosts, anticipating needs, and taking quiet pride in their ability to adapt. At the end of the week, when a final wave of guests departed, the feedback from the delegation's coordinator was unequivocal. Your team operates with a rare blend of precision and warmth. We never felt like an event to be managed. We felt like guests to be understood. That evening, after the last piece of luggage had been loaded and the lobby returned to its normal rhythm, Martin called Caleb into his office. He didn't begin with a preamble. I've been in this business a long time, he said, and I can tell you, weeks like this are where reputations are made. You've done more than keep us afloat. You've set a new standard, and it's one we can build on. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a proposal to make Caleb's interim role permanent, along with a revised budget for expanding the cultural integration framework to other guest segments. Caleb accepted the folder quietly, but the weight of the moment was not lost on him. This was not just a personal promotion. It was the institutionalizing of a philosophy he had fought to prove. As he left the office, he paused in the lobby, watching a housekeeper adjust a floral arrangement while quietly greeting a guest in their native language. It struck him that the most important thing they had built over the past weeks was not a tea lounge or a payment system or a set of KPIs. It was a culture where no one was invisible, where skill and care could surface from any corner, and where the bridge between guest and host was not a fixed structure but a living, adaptable path. He knew that keeping that culture alive would require vigilance. But for the first time, he also knew he would not be carrying that responsibility alone. The glow of the delegation's praise still lingered in the air when the next challenge arrived, unannounced and unforgiving. It came not in the form of a planned visit or a high-profile booking, but as an emergency, a full-scale disruption that would stretch every skill, instinct, and ounce of composure the team had cultivated. It began on a Wednesday afternoon in early spring when the lobby was busy with midweek check-ins, a small wedding party preparing for a rehearsal dinner, and a handful of regular business travelers catching up on emails in the lounge. Caleb had been in a meeting with Priya reviewing early-stage plans for expanding cultural integration initiatives to new markets, when his phone lit up with a priority alert from the city's Emergency Services Coordination Center. A fire had broken out in a nearby high-rise office building, forcing the evacuation of hundreds of people, many of whom were being directed to the Clarendon Grand as a temporary shelter because it was the nearest facility with the capacity to receive them. The message carried the weight of urgency. Arrival in less than 30 minutes, unknown mix of evacuees, possible medical needs, language diversity, and high emotional distress. Caleb didn't waste a second. He left the meeting mid-sentence, striding directly to the operations hub and calling for a Level 2 response protocol, a plan originally designed for mass event contingencies but never fully activated in his tenure. He gathered department heads on the fly, speaking quickly but clearly. We are about to receive an influx of people. Some may be injured, many will be frightened, and there will be no time to segment them into easy categories. We use what we know, we stay flexible, and we remember, every person walking in will be looking for a sign that they are safe. Martin, standing just behind him, gave a curt nod and began making calls to secure additional staffing from off-duty personnel. Priya left to coordinate which floors could be cleared for temporary accommodation. Noah began prepping extra Wi-Fi hotspots, chargers, and device loaners, anticipating that evacuees might need to contact loved ones. Within 20 minutes, the first wave arrived, office workers in smoke-dusted suits, a few wearing masks hastily tied from scarves, some clutching laptops, others carrying nothing but their phones. The front desk team, already briefed, skipped the usual check-in process, directing people toward the ballroom, which had been converted into a holding area with water stations, chairs, and a projection screen displaying rolling updates from the city's emergency network. Caleb moved through the room, switching languages as needed, Mandarin for a group of visiting consultants, French for a pair of tourists caught in the evacuation, simple, clear English for those too shaken to process much at all. His presence was steady, neither overly formal nor falsely cheerful. It was the tone of someone who understood that safety was communicated as much through demeanor as through words. As the ballroom filled, it became clear that some evacuees would need more than a few hours of shelter. The fire, though contained, had left their building unsafe for re-entry. Arrangements were made to house them overnight, and here the groundwork laid by the cultural integration pilots began to pay dividends in unexpected ways. Staff accustomed to adjusting room allocations for multi-generation family groups quickly reconfigured suites to accommodate colleagues who wanted to stay together. The tea lounge, normally a place of calm business preparation, was repurposed into a quiet recovery zone for those most visibly distressed, offering warm drinks, low lighting, and staff trained to give space without neglect. Payment preferences were irreal. Vant now, but the PSP infrastructure was used to log temporary room assignments and amenities without forcing evacuees to queue or fill out lengthy forms. In the chaos, small moments stood out. Marco, the bartender, kneeling to speak with a young woman in her 20s who had lost track of her elderly father in the evacuation, offering her both reassurance and a cup of hot tea while coordinating with security to locate him. Elena, using her background in communications, crafting a simple multilingual update sheet that could be distributed to evacuees every hour so they knew the status of the situation without relying solely on the news. Priya, directing her team to prepare connecting rooms for a group of mothers with young children so they could support one another through the night. By evening, the hotel had taken in nearly 200 people. The original guests, those here for weddings, business, or leisure, were briefed personally by Martin and Caleb, who explained the circumstances and offered accommodations for any inconvenience. The response from these guests was overwhelmingly supportive. Many even volunteered to help, from carrying water to assisting with translation. One German businessman who had been in the Focus Lounge earlier in the week spent hours helping translate for a group of German-speaking evacuees, impressed by how smoothly the hotel was managing such an unplanned influx. The turning point in the night came when a second, unexpected complication arose. Among the evacuees was a group of foreign investors who had flown in for a high-stakes meeting the next day, ironically a meeting that had been scheduled at the very building now closed by the fire. They were understandably anxious, knowing that delays or cancellations could jeopardize their negotiations. Caleb listened to their concerns and, drawing on his experience with the Victor Liang delegation, offered a solution on the spot. The Clarendon Grand would host their meeting in one of its executive suites the next morning, complete with translation support, technology setup, and refreshments tailored to their needs. He personally oversaw the preparations, ensuring that the impromptu venue would feel not like a fallback, but like a deliberate, high-quality choice. Throughout the night, the staff rotated in shifts, but Caleb stayed on the floor, circulating between the ballroom, the tea lounge, and the impromptu conference setup. He checked in with evacuees personally, ensuring that anyone with specific dietary, medical, or language needs was addressed promptly. He also maintained a steady communication stream with the city's emergency services, providing updates and adapting the hotel's arrangements as the situation evolved. By dawn, the building across the street was still closed, but the evacuees at the Clarendon Grand were rested, fed, and informed. The investors had their meeting on schedule, and the young woman from the night before was reunited with her father, thanks to a coordinated effort between hotel security and emergency responders. When the last of the evacuees left later that day, many stopped at the front desk to express gratitude, some in halting English, others in their native tongues, but all with the same underlying sentiment. The hotel had made them feel safe, cared for, and respected in a moment of uncertainty. The city's tourism bureau took note, sending an official letter of commendation to Martin and his team, praising the hotel's swift and compassionate response. Industry contacts began sharing the story informally, holding it up as an example of what genuine hospitality looks like when tested outside the boundaries of normal operations. That evening, as the hotel settled back into its usual rhythm, Martin found Caleb in the now quiet tea lounge. They sat without speaking for a moment, letting the silence stretch. Then Martin said, "You know, I used to think leadership was about planning everything so nothing unexpected could throw you off. Now I think it's about preparing people so that when the unexpected comes, they don't flinch." Caleb smiled faintly. "We didn't build this culture for weeks like this," he replied. "We built it so that any week could be handled like this." In the days that followed, Caleb made sure the lessons from the evacuation were captured, not just in a report, but in training modules, checklists, and scenario rehearsals. He understood that the memory of a crisis fades quickly, and with it, the instinct to keep systems sharp. The story of the evacuation was told in staff briefings not as a badge of honor, but as a proof point. Adaptability, empathy, and preparation were not separate skills, they were the foundation of everything. What Caleb didn't know yet was that this unexpected trial by fire, literally, had reached further than the city's borders. Among the evacuees was a regional director for an international hospitality group who had quietly observed how the Clarendon Grand managed the situation. In a few short weeks, that observation would open a door to a decision that could change the trajectory of Caleb's career and the hotel's place in the industry forever. 2 weeks after the evacuation, the Clarendon Grand had settled back into its steady rhythm, yet under the polished surface there was a new current of quiet confidence running through the staff. They had faced something unpredictable, something that could have spiraled into chaos and instead had turned it into a moment of resilience and pride. Caleb noticed it in the way housekeeping staff exchanged nods when sing in the hallways, in the relaxed authority with which front desk agents handled guest requests, and in the casual but genuine smiles from the tea lounge servers when explaining the concept to newcomers. The culture they had worked to build over months had been tested in fire and found not only intact but stronger. What he didn't know was that the ripple effect of that night had extended far beyond the guests who experienced it. Late one Thursday afternoon, Martin called Caleb into his office. On his desk sat an envelope with an embossed International Hotel Association seal, and beside it, a sleek black folder. Martin's tone carried a mix of intrigue and significance. "You remember the older gentleman from the evacuation? The one who kept mostly to himself in the ballroom?" Caleb nodded. He remembered him clearly, a quiet, observant figure who spoke sparingly but seemed to be studying everything. Martin leaned forward. "He's the regional director for Alistair Global Hospitality Group, one of the largest luxury hotel portfolios in the world. He was here that night not as an investor or a casual traveler, but as a guest evaluating whether our city could host a major summit they're planning." Martin slid the folder across the desk. "He sent us a proposal. They want the Clarendon Grand to be the flagship host for the summit, and they specifically named our adaptability during the crisis as the deciding factor. And," Martin paused, his gaze steady, "they've also asked if you would be available to consult on operational readiness for several of their properties overseas." Caleb opened the folder. Inside was a formal invitation for the Clarendon Grand to host the summit, along with a separate letter addressed to him personally. The letter praised the seamless integration of cultural awareness into operational execution, the way the hotel had maintained dignity and composure under pressure, and the rare ability to inspire a team to think beyond their roles without losing focus on the guest experience. It concluded with an offer for him to lead a 6-month consulting program in Asia and Europe, helping selected properties replicate the kind of systems he had put in place here. Caleb read the letter twice, the weight of it settling over him. This was more than recognition. It was an opening into the global arena he had once dreamed of before life had redirected him into quieter corners. He sat back, silent for a long moment. "If I leave for 6 months, who holds the line here?" he asked finally. Martin gave a small smile. "That's the thing. You've built a system that doesn't fall apart if you're not in the room. We'd have interim leaders in place, people you've already trained. This isn't about abandoning what you've built. It's about proving it can live beyond you." The words struck something deep in Caleb. For years, his worth had been tied to showing up in person, to being the one who could solve a problem in real time. Now, the true test of his leadership would be whether the culture and processes he'd put in place could thrive without his constant presence. Over the next few days, Caleb thought about the offer. He walked the hotel's corridors in the early morning when only a skeleton staff was on duty, listening to the natural hum of operations. He spent hours in quiet observation, watching Marco adjust a tea pour without prompting, hearing a concierge switch seamlessly between Spanish and Japanese, seeing a housekeeping attendant off, ere a warm, unhurried greeting to a guest even while juggling a tight turnaround. It dawned on him that what they had built was not fragile. It had roots, and those roots were deep enough to sustain growth beyond these walls. When Caleb finally accepted the offer, he did it on two conditions. First, that his consulting work for Alistair Global would include a knowledge-sharing agreement that allowed the Clarendon Grand to benefit from the innovations and insights he gathered abroad. Second, that part of his consulting fee be used to create a hidden talents program modeled after the one they had informally nurtured, giving frontline staff opportunities to reveal and develop skills beyond their current roles. Martin agreed without hesitation, knowing that this was not just a retention of talent, but an investment in the hotel's future identity. In the weeks that followed, Caleb worked on transitioning his responsibilities. Elena was tapped to oversee the cultural integration framework locally, Priya took charge of operational logistics for special events, and Noah was given expanded authority over guest-facing technology systems. Caleb held a series of workshops with department leads, focusing not on telling them what to do, but on teaching them how to adapt to what they didn't expect. If you can answer why before you answer how, he told them, you'll always find a path forward even when the map changes. The day before his departure, Caleb gathered the entire staff in the ballroom. There was no formal agenda, just a moment to recognize the journey they had taken together. He spoke without notes, his voice carrying easily in the high-ceilinged space. When I first started here, I thought I was just passing through. I didn't imagine I'd still be here years later, much less standing in this room as your colleague and your director. But what I've learned is that titles matter less than actions, and uniforms matter less than the skills and care you bring to the people you serve. We've proven that no one in this building is invisible unless they choose to be. That's the culture we've built, and it's what will carry you forward long after I'm gone from this room. He looked around at the faces, some smiling, some teary, all attentive, and felt a rare sense of completion. I'm leaving for a while, but not away from you. Everything we've done here, I'll be carrying to other places, and everything I learn there, I'll bring back. This isn't the end of anything. It's just the widening of the bridge we started together. The applause that followed was not loud or raucous. It was steady and sustained, the kind of applause that holds someone in place for a few moments longer than they expect. On his first morning abroad, standing in the lobby of a five-star property in Singapore, Caleb felt the same flicker of anticipation he had once felt before pushing a cleaning cart past the boardroom at the Clarendon Grand. He knew that somewhere inside this hotel, there were people whose skills were hidden from view, waiting for the right moment to surface. And he knew exactly how to find them, not with titles or tests, but with the simple, game-changing act of seeing them fully. Back in his office at the Clarendon Grand, Martin kept a framed photo from the evacuation night. Not of the chaos or the packed ballroom, but of a quiet moment. Caleb, leaning slightly toward a Mandarin-speaking evacuee, listening intently while holding a notepad. Beneath the photo, Martin had written a single line that had become the hotel's unofficial credo: see the person, build the bridge, let it stand. It was a reminder to everyone who passed through that leadership wasn't about being the hero in the room. It was about making sure everyone knew they had a place in building the future. And so, as the Clarendon Grand prepared for the upcoming global summit and Caleb began shaping the operations of hotels an ocean away, the story of a man once seen only as a janitor had become something more than an inspiring anecdote. It had become a living blueprint for how unseen talent, when recognized and empowered, could change not just the course of a meeting or the fortunes of a hotel, but the very definition of excellence in an industry built on the art of seeing.